Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome and Happy New Year on behalf of Harif. We are the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We are a small band of volunteers based in London, and this is the fourth year that we are running a Zoom program with a session taking place roughly every 2 weeks on different aspects of history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We've done over 120 sessions to date. We do have a website, www.harif.org, and there you will find recordings of all our past Zooms and also a listing of events. To get login details for our events, you have to be subscribed to Harif. Just fill in the subscription form. It's free, and you will receive login details. We also have a sister website. It's a news blog called Point of No Return, and that is updated every day. And you can get to it through the Harif website. Just click on news. This session is being recorded, and the recording hopefully will be up within a few hours. And it's also being live streamed to the Harif Facebook page. There will be an opportunity to put questions, but we do ask you to type them in the chat, which is the button at the bottom of your screen. So on to the topic of tonight's Zoom, and that is a Sephardi Turkish Patriot, the title of a book about a man called Gad Franco, who was a prominent Sephardi journalist, lawyer, and jurist who opposed Zionism and worked for the Jewish community to be integrated into the Turkish Republic. However, the harassment of minorities, inflamed by ethno-nationalism, deepened in the 1930s and peaked during World War II. By then, Gad was a wealthy, respected Jewish community spokesperson and supporter of the Republic's first president, Kemal Ataturk. Gad Franco was then dealt a terrible punishment in a shocking campaign to Turkify the economy, and this was imposed on all minorities, the wealth tax, or Varlik Vergesi. As a result, Franco underwent a transformation from Turkish patriot to repentant Zionist. So we are delighted to welcome the author of this book, Franco's grandson, Anthony Gad Bigio, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. And Anthony will present his biography of Gad Franco, the Sephardi Turkish Patriot. Anthony is an architect and town planner who has worked for the World Bank for 20 years. He is now a professor of urban planning and a consultant, and he advises international agencies, all the while pursuing his personal writing projects. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Anthony, and thank you very much for joining us.
Lynn, it's a delight to be here. And I'm very, very grateful to you and to Harif in general for hosting this talk and giving me the opportunity to share with you and all the participants. I see, I believe, 75 people in the space here who are here to go through the story together with us, as it were. And so thank you for the introduction. It is absolutely right on. I will spare further details about myself, but just to say about the book that, yes, it is the biography, the historical biography of my grandfather. It is also a little bit the reconstruction of this complicated trajectory that Turkish Jews went through during the first half of the 20th century, which is really the last 2 decades of the empire and the first 3 of the republic. And that vision that Lynn alluded to was a very liberal vision of inclusion, tolerance, acceptance of minorities. That's what Gad Franco pursued all his life, the rule of law, trying to help construct a Turkish republican polity which would be equal to all, and where, of course, Jews could have their space, thrive, and contribute to the well-being of the country and of society. That did not turn out to be the case, as Lynn already alluded to, and I'll be giving you more details about that. I did want to, though, say a couple of words about my personal family to give you a sense of my connections to the Sephardic world. My father was a British journalist. He was born in Southport, from a family from Manchester that was originally from Aleppo. The family went back to Europe, first to France and then to Egypt, where he grew up, became a journalist, then a war correspondent. He covered the Second World War for the British press, as well as Israel's War of Independence in 1948. My mother was Gad Franco's eldest daughter. She was born in Smyrna, as you will see. She grew up in Istanbul, went to Paris for a college education at the Sorbonne, came back to Istanbul, and then eventually, when she married, moved to Cairo. And then the 2 of them, after the Second World War, settled in Rome. And that's where I was born. Now, my connection to Turkey early on was pretty limited because my mother, who had suffered quite a lot of traumas, as you'll hear more about, was very reluctant to go back for a long time. And Gad himself passed away when I was only 3 and had never gotten the chance to see me. So that's what brings me to talk to you more about the book. My own itinerary of research started in my 20s, trying to understand how this Jewish Turkish world I was connected to. Started in my 20s, but really accelerated in the last 10, 12 years as I met Rifat Bali, who's a prominent historian of Turkish Jewry, who wrote extensively about them and also about Gad. And as I mentioned before, my book just came out like a month and a half ago. I will try to highlight in the course of my talk some key themes that I think are really relevant to this complex trajectory of the Turkish Jewish community, and perhaps we can go back to some of those themes during the Q&A. So without further ado, let's start from the start. Gad Franco was born in Milas, a small town on the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, in 1881 to a lineage of rabbis. His father was a rabbi, his grandfather had been a rabbi, and his uncle, Moshe Franco, was also a rabbi and an educator. And Moshe lived on the island of Rhodes, which is, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. And when Gad was 6, he was sent off to Rhodes for his education. And this is a really life-changing event because Gad was educated right from the beginning in Turkish and in French and in Hebrew, of course. He went to the local high school, which was a recently established, forward-looking educational establishment, and came back to Milas as really the first fully educated young man in the family, and started teaching at the local Jewish school in Milas, where he taught French and Turkish, and eventually became the director. So a couple of images just to give you a sense of places and people. This is where Milas is located on the coast. Rhodes is right here. Smyrna somewhere in between the two. Here's Crete, Greece, and Constantinople over here. And this is Gad, back row in the front, the shortest and the youngest perhaps of that group of young Jewish men who were all together as part of this Juven Union, which was the youth association of Milas. And even that term Juven Union should make you start thinking about the languages that these people spoke, right? Because I mentioned French, I mentioned Turkish, but in reality, Turkish Jews were speaking Ladino. That was the language that they had inherited from the exile in 1492 from Spain, and it had remained pretty much intact for 400 years. Yes, it had taken in a few words of Turkish or Greek or Slav, depending on where it was spoken in the empire, but ultimately it was really ancient Castilian that somehow was the custodian of their Iberian identity. And that remained such until the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a philanthropic organization out of Paris, arrived in the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century and started opening up schools. These schools obviously were delivering a more modern education, which was entirely in French. And therefore, the Turkish Jewish community was exposed to a radical shift of languages. And although Ladino remained the language that people speak at home, the one they were most comfortable in, they started embracing Western-minded education, and obviously through the French language, getting access to French literature and European modern thinking, science, and so on. So this is a very profound transformation that happened. Together with education and the language, the Alliance was also promoting very much the modernization of Turkish Jewry, which had remained pretty primitive. So in that context, in fact, Gad was really the exception, having been educated in Turkish as well as French. He was able to connect to all sorts of intellectual circles, journalists, and so on, that were precluded to the rest of the community, given that Turkish, in fact, as we will see, was not learned and spoken by Turkish Jews until much later in the 20th century. And so Gad moved to Smyrna when he was 21. In fact, he was in touch with some Turkish journalists who were writing in Turkish newspapers, and he embraced journalism as his profession, joined a prominent local Ladino newspaper, and in his writings, as a very young man in his 20s, started writing about Jewish identity, but also about the opportunities for Jewish modernization. And through this modernization, for a greater role that Turkish Jews could play in Ottoman society. At the same time, he was looking at the challenges that came with this transformation and realizing that an excessive Europeanization of Turkish Jewry could have compromised its own religious and ethnic identity. So trying to find that balance between remaining who they always had been, but finding a way for the community to get out of its isolation and join Ottoman society more at large. And the real opportunity came in 1909, when the Young Turk Revolution took place. Gad was already a member of the Comité Union et Progrès, the Committee for Union and Progress, which was this secret society, really, that eventually managed to take over and to impose on the Sultan the return of constitutional law. And there was a brief period of about 2 years during which Ottomanism really created opportunities that were unheard of before. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But returning to Gad, he realized that law and the rule of law was really what mattered. And he trained himself as a lawyer, took the bar exam in Istanbul and passed it beautifully. He was second in his cohort, and started practicing as a lawyer, and also at the age of 30 married. In fact, he married the daughter of David Fresco, who was very prominent editor, journalist, and publisher of El Tiempo, which was the most important Ladino newspaper of those times. And so through that marriage, Gad really integrated the intelligentsia of Turkish Jewry of the time. A few more images to give you a flavor of those people and places. We were here with the Union. Here is Smyrna at the turn of the century, 1890, a postcard from 1890. You see the quay, you see the boats. This is a thriving city, cosmopolitan, full of Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Muslim Turks, of course, Levantines, European families that had been there for a long time, and they were promoting trade and the exchange with Europe. The quay was a major piece of urban infrastructure put in place to facilitate international commerce. And we don't have much more time to talk about it, but let's say that it was really the hub of this multicultural, multilingual polity that existed in Smyrna, and that was kind of pushing progress through during those times. Here's Gad as a young journalist sitting at his desk writing the articles I was telling you about. Here's Gad as an established lawyer, Smyrna, married man, roughly 1910. And here was David Fresco, the gentleman I was telling you about, his father-in-law and this prestigious intellectual and very interesting person who left very important writings behind him. So what about Ottomanism, and why is that relevant to Gad's story? Well, Ottomanism was really an attempt, unfortunately short-lived, of establishing a secular society during Ottoman times, where the constitution would guarantee that, in fact, there was space for all minorities. And the Young Turks, these army officers who had seized power and who had established parliament and so on, who opened parliament to minorities, did a number of very encouraging things, were really promoting an idea of a much more modern empire where there would be space for everybody. And this is something that enthused all the minorities, Arabs, the Jews, the Greeks, and the Armenians were very much encouraged to kind of join this reformed polity, which is based on secular beliefs, on French Revolution principles, and so on. And of course, this was very much also in line with what the Alliance had been promoting for that point, good 3 decades, right? The idea that Turkish Jews should assimilate, should integrate society, should maintain their identity, the religious identity, but ultimately behave as citizens of a common polity with everybody else. And perhaps out of all the minorities, the Jews were really the ones who were the most interested in this proposition that was coming from the government, because the Greeks and the Armenians, in fact, were pretty ambiguous and mostly interested in carving out chunks of the Ottoman territory for themselves, right? And we know that European powers, Britain and France in particular, were the ones who were pushing them to go ahead as they were trying to undermine the Ottoman Empire. So there was quite some ambiguity on that side. And this is relevant also in the face of another big, powerful movement that emerged around then, which was Zionism, right? So we know that, of course, Herzl started contacting the Sultan actually as of 1896 and trying to convince the Sultan that perhaps a territorial compromise could be made over the Ottoman province of Palestine, and that a Jewish homeland could be created over there. He also enlisted the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, to lobby the Sultan, but the Sultan wouldn't hear about it, right? The Sultan was defending its empire, the integrity of its empire, which was already threatened in other parts of the world, most notably the Balkans. And so the Zionists, in addition to obviously pursuing their policy goals with the court, they also approached the Turkish Jewish community with this proposition of saying, well, you know, you're Jews, you should be really fighting for the same ideal of the creation of a separate homeland. And this frightened Gad Franco and David Fresco and all the other intellectuals of the time, of the community, very much, because they thought that they would be perceived by the Ottomans, by the government, but also by the populace, by the Muslim majority, as having a double allegiance, of having yes, wanting to be Ottomans, but at the same time having their own independentist project. And that they could be perceived as traitors. So there was a lot of pushback. And keep in mind that the tensions between other minorities and the government were already pretty strong, as I mentioned before. And also keep in mind that these intellectuals really, these Jewish intellectuals really were molded by the education and principles of the Alliance, which were really presenting to them the same kind of trajectory that French Jews had followed, right? Successfully integrating society, being accepted, integrated, and that's what Turkish Jews should have done. Here come the Zionists proposing something completely different. So there was a lot of antagonism and lots of writings. Gad was actually very prominently in the forefront of this confrontation between Zionists and anti-Zionists. Then eventually what happened was that the Ottoman Empire started losing control, and the Zionist movement, about at the time of the First World War, sort of lost interest in the dialogue with the Ottoman government and shifted rather its diplomacy towards the British Empire. So yes, Ottomanism was a short-lived dream of coexistence, which was taken down by an awful decade of war that ensued, which ravaged the Ottoman Empire. First, the Italo-Turkish War of 1911, the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, then, of course, the First World War, right, which devastated the empire like so much, the rest of Europe, really. And, of course, the Armenian genocide took place in that context in 1915. So through that, Gad was still in Smyrna, working as a lawyer. He became the president of the lay council of the Jewish community. He was working very hard to keep all the institutions of the community working, the schools open, the charities going, getting contributions from abroad, while things were very tough on the ground. And while also trying to protect as much as he could some other minorities. And those of you who read the book will see that he actually acted very forcefully to protect the Armenians of Smyrna, who were threatened with genocide like the other Armenians of Turkey. So he was somebody who was not only looking after his community, but really after these principles of coexistence and peaceful development that were really at the core of his thinking. Those years, and here again an important theme we may want to get back to, there were years where an enormous Sephardic diaspora started taking place, an enormous exile. About half of Ottoman Jews migrated, and that would be about 100,000 people. First, to avoid military draft, which was imposed upon them for the first time, and also to seek better opportunities abroad. And that's where we see that French that had been learned in the generation before came of great use to Turkish Jews who could move to France or move to other countries speaking French and move to the United States. And when the United States in 1924 cracked down on immigration, then they started turning more towards Latin America, Central America, where the Ladino was the tool through which they could connect to local societies. And we see the interplay of the existing diasporas, the existing Jewish communities abroad in the States and France and so on, helping out in this massive exodus of people out of Turkey. And that was, a real turning point. The community was reduced by half. Gad was still there. But then eventually the Greeks attempted their coup, landed and invaded Smyrna, backed by the British and the French. And Gad simply couldn't take it. And he also decided to move and went off to Paris with his family. Photo of them. Right, so here is Gad, Elise, the children, and a maid in a public park in Paris in 1920. And he was writing to his parents on the back of this photo saying, everything is fine, we arrived, lots of love, and so on and so forth. But as Gad was in exile, as it were, in Paris, Mustafa Kemal, the future Ataturk, regained control, military control of the country. And Gad was following events from afar and made this extraordinary decision that he had to go back. So while all those Jews who had left found ways of settling in, surviving, or in some cases even thriving in their new context, here was Gad, who was doing pretty well in Paris and pursuing his law school, and who decided that no, he had to go back to Turkey. That was his country. The country was re-emerging from the ashes of the First World War, and his role was to go back and to help reconstruct this country. And this caused tremendous conflicts with his wife, who was perfectly happy in Paris and had no interest in going back. But Gad decided that that was his moral duty, and that's what he needed to do, and did so, moved everybody back. So in 1922, Gad and family moved back to Istanbul. He opened his practice. And to go quickly, otherwise I would take too much time with the whole story, let's say that what follows are a couple of decades, right, from when Gad is 40, 1922, to when he's 60, 2 decades during which Gad thrived and had a very successful life in Istanbul. First, as a constitutional scholar, he had his doctor's degree from his PhD from Sorbonne as a lawyer and a jurist, specializing in constitutional law. He opened a journal of juridical studies, which he self-financed and kept going for 16 years, which was really the intellectual bridge between rather backward Turkey and sophisticated Europe, where juridical thinking had evolved and had become so prominent. And so he was doing all he could to make sure that he provided a bridge between the two. He was also a successful lawyer. His practice thrived. He was representing foreign firms investing in Turkey, became a very wealthy man, very well established. And third thing, he was constantly working for the Jewish community, representing its interest in sometimes difficult dialogues with the government, always doing his best to protect its interest and to defend it against a number of things that were going not the way he was hoping they would. And throughout, Gad really, in his writings, which continued in his public speaking, and he was writing in Turkish newspapers, in Ladino newspapers, in Francophone papers, his books on education, his books about law, and so on. What comes across, and especially through the editorials in his journal, what comes across is a vision of Western liberalism, of rule of law as the cardinal value on which society should be organized. He was very much in favor of the modernization of the country that Ataturk was promoting and making happen, and of course of acceptance of minorities. So pluralism, liberalism, some fundamental values which still, I think, resonate with a lot of us today. And throughout, he was a staunch patriot, really, hence the title of the book, right? And a staunch believer in the future Kemalist republic and what the republic could deliver. Although, as I mentioned, there were pretty concerning signs that things were not going the way they could have. And then, as Lynn mentioned before in the introduction, in 1942, at the peak of his career and personal success, Gad was taken down by the government in a punishing campaign to expropriate the Jewish, Greek, and Armenian minorities and to Turkify the economy. The government was in trouble. The coffers were empty. They had spent all their money in all sorts of military preparations, although Turkey remained neutral during the Second World War. And suddenly the government turned against the minorities and said, well, this is our chance to grab everything we can and spoliate them and make sure that only Muslims will have control of their economy. So all his properties were confiscated, and 15 days later, as he couldn't meet these incredibly punishing requests coming from the government, he was packed off to labor camp, together with a number of other prominent Armenians, Jews, and Greeks, and was sent off to the center of Anatolia, shovel snow in the winter. This is an elderly gentleman of 60. And this was the catastrophe, right, where everything collapsed. Not only was he expropriated of all his belongings, but really his whole intellectual apparatus came crashing down, right? His beliefs in the Republic, his beliefs in the rule of law. Here was the Republic for which he had done everything he could all his life, turning against him and against his people in what he called a medieval way. And he was very outspoken before he was carried off to labor camp. And his outspokenness, of course, got the government very angry and just made the punishment even harsher. So he came back devastated, barely survived the labor camp experience. He was disbarred. He was prevented from traveling to Palestine, Mandate Palestine, where he wanted to go right away. He was refused a passport. And ultimately, he came back from this experience a broken man. So a few photos to take you quickly through this phase of his life. We left him in Paris here in the public park. Here he is wearing his fez upon return to Istanbul, well-dressed gentleman ready to support the government in the Lausanne negotiations for the peace conference. Here are the Commando stairs, very close to where Gad settled his office on Bankalar Caddesi in Istanbul. Here is Gad with his youngest son, Emil, who would eventually become a lawyer like himself. And here are two interesting photos of Gad and his wife in Wiesbaden and his daughters also on Wiesbaden Lake. And I put those in really to point you to an interesting aspect of ambiguity of what was going on at the time. Let me just come back to kind of look at you. So Gad, yes, was this Turkish patriot, was writing his articles about speaking Turkish and integrating Turkish society and so on. But at the same time, the household was living in a very westernized bubble, right? They spoke French at home. The literature, the music was classical music. The intellectual references were all the French philosophers of the Enlightenment. And where ultimately this family, like other families, like David Fresco's family and so on, felt more at home were probably in Europe, right? During the trips to Paris or during the trips to Wiesbaden or places like that, where their, let's say, ambiguous identity of being Turks and Jews, but also very Francophone and Francophiles was playing out in a different way. So that's something which eventually also became a problem in terms of the perception of the Turkish government of this Jewish elite that was working, integrating the economy and the profession and so on, but that had its very profound ties to another world, which was not the one that Mustafa Kemal was pursuing. So maybe I'll take you back to some more images here. So from Wiesbaden to the 40s. So here's a horrible caricature of the Jew as it was appearing in the Turkish press of the times. It resonates, I think, with all of us for having seen similar cartoons from so many countries. And here's Gad in his lawyer's robes, still battling for the rule of law. This is the building that Gad had bought from the Commandos on Bankalar Caddesi, very close to those steps you saw a photo of a minute ago. And this is the building which was worth obviously a lot of money that was taken from him at the time of the Varlik and was confiscated and resold and so on. And the confiscations were not only of real assets, but also of household goods. So Gad's apartment was invaded by the police. All the goods were stripped off the walls and the floors and so on and sold in the street. This is not Gad's belongings, but a similar street auction that was happening at the time. So the city was really turned upside down by these horrible deportations, arrests, deportations, expropriations, and this ripping apart of the fabric of Istanbul society in this horrible way. This is a group of the first convoy of deportees making their way through the snow. Gad is not in the photo, but his comrades were. But here is Gad, actually in a rare photo from the newspapers of the time. He's number 2 in the photo next to another prominent Jewish lawyer, Shekip Adut. There they are with labor camps as they were shoveling snow. You can probably see the handle of a shovel in Gad's hand, actually. And so that's the kind of horror story that he went through. So to explain this extraordinary transformation, right, from prominent jurist to convict, actually, I think we have to spend a moment to try to understand what happened in Turkey in those decades and how this republic that came up with this very modern sounding constitution where all the secular principles of the French Revolution had been put in writing and where equality was on paper promised to all, how is it possible that in fact in a couple of decades it became this very authoritarian machine? And the book does analyze a little bit how Ataturk reconstructed a collective identity, right, for Turkey, which was really based on ethno-nationalism. If we think of the Ottoman Empire, we don't have too much time to go into details, but it was a rather sprawling polity, pretty tolerant. People speaking different languages in different parts of the world, from the Balkans to Arabia to the Maghreb and so on, right? And so, yes, there was the central power in Constantinople, but ultimately there was a lot of loose systems to keep everybody on board with their differences, their languages, their religions, and so on. As Ataturk reconstructed this country with what is left of the empire, a different kind of glue was needed, right? And so the glue was found in Turkish identity, which had to do with some myths of where the Turks were originally from Central Asia. The language, Turkish language, became fundamental. It was reformed by Ataturk, was taught in schools. There were huge campaigns for Turkish to be spoken. What were the Jews doing? They were speaking Ladino, they were speaking French, anything but Turkish, right? And this riled up the Turks very much. So little by little, although at the outset in 1923, when the Republic was funded, the Jews were considered normal citizens. There was no particular anti-Semitic campaign going on. Little by little, things built up against them, right? So what language was being used in Jewish schools to teach their children? It was French. So Turks said, sorry, you've got to shut those down. So those were shut down. Their independent institutions with which they had managed their community for hundreds of years, those were shut down. So little by little, the Jews were cornered into feeling less and less part of this polity, although they would have very much liked to be accepted. Things went from bad to worse. In 1934, there was a big pogrom in Thrace against the Jews who fled. About 10,000 Jews fled the province of Thrace and sought refuge in Istanbul and other places. There were labor battalions which were put together in 1941, where only Greeks, Armenians, and Jews were recruited to go about building military infrastructure under obviously Muslim command. And these were people including Gad's young brother Marcel, who were fearing for their life every day during that year of forced labor. And then finally we got to the Varlik of 42, 43, which was a real disaster. So one thing I just want to make sure I'm not misinterpreted here. I honestly cannot say that what we are confronting was anti-Semitism in Turkey. I think it was a much broader marginalization and persecution of minorities in general. And in fact, the one minority that suffered the most at the hands of Ataturk and the Republican government were the Kurds that tried repeatedly to rebel. So I think we need this bigger context to understand what happened to, to the Jews of Turkey during Republican times. So back to Gad, and trying to make it quick. The last decade of Gad's life was really a painful aftermath of this terrible downfall I described. He faced more humiliation, huge debts to repay, the breakup of his family, and the departure of many of its members abroad, his daughters, his brother. Terrible conflicts with his wife, who kept on saying, I told you we shouldn't have left Paris when we did. And here we are, look at the state in which we find ourselves now, living like paupers, humiliated, and so on. And his son, Emil, actually is the one who stepped in after a couple of years, which he spent in Mandate Palestine. He came back, picked up the pieces. He was a lawyer himself, trained as a lawyer, and regained control of Gad's legal practice, and little by little tried to keep things together and to support his aging parents, while Marcel, his young brother, had moved to the States and was really looking after himself. And so Gad's death took place in '54 and was mourned by a large chunk of the Istanbul Jewish community, given that he had been such an important representative of what their life had been for so long. So a few last images. We were here in labor camp. So this is Emil and his wife in Tel Aviv in '44, before they returned to Turkey. Here's a meeting of three brothers from the left to the right. There's Levi, Marcel, and Gad. They met in '47 in Paris to somehow come to terms with this pile of debts that was making Gad's life impossible. And Levi, who had been away for 25 years, very generously stepped in and helped him out, while Marcel, who had moved to the States, became very stingy and was only making money available on a loan basis to the family, which was very painful for everybody. And then finally, here's Gad's tomb in the Jewish cemetery of Navut-Koy. So a last theme perhaps to put across, we may want to get back to, is that as all of this was unfolding, and as in fact the single party period of Turkish history had come to an end, and as of 1950, Turkey, under the US's protective wing, adopted a more open-minded political system with a number of parties that were allowed. Nevertheless, we see that again, half of Turkish Jews decided to leave. First, it was to mandate Palestine, although with great difficulties, because obviously getting there was very hard. I won't go into the details, but I do in the book. And then, of course, as soon as the State of Israel was created in 1948, there was a huge flow of Turkish Jews. 40,000 people left. So if you think of the size of the community, it was about 220,000 at the beginning of the century, 100,000 left First World War, and half of the half left at the end of the Second World War, right, in the early 50s, leaving for Israel. And yes, of course, some may have been genuine Zionists who were eager to join the construction of the collective land of the Jews in Palestine, Israel at that point. But ultimately, it was the sense of betrayal, having been failed, of having been expropriated of any sense of belonging, that made so that Turkish Jews left in droves for Israel. Some stayed behind, and roughly, although obviously we're simplifying things, it was mostly the Ladino-speaking, the poorer, the more religious Jews who left, and it was the professionals, the more established Jews, French-speaking, middle class, and so on, who stayed. But what Turkey was left with was really a tiny fraction of what the Jewish community had been. So how to sum it all up? I think that Gad did so himself with an article he wrote in 1950, which he titled Mea Culpa. And he courageously really looked back 50 years at when he was staunchly defending Ottomanism and the integration of Turkish Jews into the Ottoman polity, reflects on the failures, reflects on the rejection of Jews by the Turkish Republic, reflects, of course, and I quote, on the tragic events of Germany and fascism. That's the generation that got devastated by the Shoah. And he writes in his article that all of this, looking back, convinced him of Zionism's existential reasons, as his people were moving there in droves. And the creation of the State of Israel, which he now called a national refuge for the Jewish people, seemed to him the best protection against racial and religious discrimination, unquote. So this is a big turnaround, right? And this is why Lynn also mentioned this catchy title of for the talk of today, from Sephardi Turkish Patriot to repentant Zionist, which is actually something that one of my reviewers, Professor Elden, mentioned in his comments. There was certainly a very bitter sense of failure that Gad experienced during this last period of his life, as everything had fallen apart and all his dreams and ideals had not materialized. He was still, though, quite hopeful beyond the future of the State of Israel, also for the Jewish diaspora that could, as he said, fight for the principle of equality of rights in every country. But clearly, you know, his life's efforts for the creation of a pluralist, truly secular and tolerant society in his home country had failed and had transformed him. And so on this rather bitter note, I will conclude my presentation. I hope I was not too long.
No, you were perfect. Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. And I've actually read the book, which is here, and I highly recommend it. A very readable account of the history of Turkish Jewry in the 20th century, I would say. I've just got two questions actually before we open it up to other questions, and that is, did the Turkish Jews ever get any kind of justice or compensation for what they lost as a result of the Varlik Vergesi wealth tax? And the second, well, that's my first question.
Okay, the answer is no. And there were a number of attempts. And it's quite interesting to see that there was no support for these attempts at requesting compensation, neither from the Turkish Jewish authorities in Turkey, nor from the American Jewish organization that had been very supportive of Turkish Jewry throughout, because Turkey recognized the State of Israel, and this diplomatic success was considered too important to endanger with any kind of trouble that bringing up issues like the compensation of the Varlik victims would have brought to the table.
It sounds terribly familiar to those of us who are involved in the fight for justice for Jews from Arab countries, actually. Because as you know, the Jews from Egypt never received compensation as part of the peace treaty that was signed between Israel and Egypt. But one thing I noticed, I was very struck by the fact that that Turkey really led the way in terms of persecution, that they were banning Zionism. Turkey banned Zionism in 1923. and also fired Jews from public service jobs in the 1920s, 10 years or even 20 years before the Arab countries did that. I mean, that was absolutely amazing to me. What would you say about that? I mean, have we kind of more or less ignored Turkey's influence, perhaps, on the Arab countries, or was this just a natural result of this ethno-nationalism?
I would tend for the latter, because yes, the Jews did get fired, but so did the Greeks, so did the Armenians. Again, I think it's important that we don't misinterpret these terrible events as specifically anti-Semitic, but rather as taking place in a polity that was reconstructing itself against all its minorities. And of course, you know, in the case of the Greeks and the Armenians, these minorities had suffered enormously, including the genocide of 1915, but had also been the tool of the European powers that were trying to undermine the Ottoman Empire. So this absolutely unacceptable rejection of minorities had some grounding, as it were, in historical facts that had occurred before. So I think the Jews, as I say, and you, Lynn, you've read the book, so you've seen that in my introduction, I do say that the Jews kind of got caught, as often happens to us, right, in conflicts going on between, you know, the European powers, the Christian nations, and the Muslim world. There we were crushed in between. I think this is perhaps a good lens to look at what happened over there.
Okay. Well, I know Professor Kerem, who is an expert on Turkish Jewry, would like to make a few points. He's done extensive research into your family, Anthony. So
I'm asking him to unmute.
Yes.
I'm not getting any reaction, unfortunately. Aha, great.
Are you there?
It's up.
Your
Physio as well. It's up.
yeah.
Yeah.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Wait.
And we can see you.
You hear me?
Yes.
You can.
It's not a good connection. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfectly.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
We can hear you perfectly.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Ooh.
Should we turn off your video so that you perhaps it will be, then it's less bandwidth. Perhaps that's better. Now, should we try? Yitzhak?
Oh dear.
You,
I think he's disappeared.
Should we give him a moment and perhaps move to another question?
Yes, certainly. Okay.
I think he had a problem with his bandwidth. Yitzhak, can you get through now?
Yeah. All right.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
All right. First of all, it's a big pleasure. And you've added a lot through the book. Your
Whoops. I think we've lost him again. Oh dear. Okay, so I'll just go through some of the questions and some very interesting comments, actually. So what was the influence of Germany on both Jewish and Muslim Turks before 1933? And to what extent did the Nazis push for expropriations after 1933? That's a question from William Clarence Smith.
Okay, well, as I mentioned before, Turkey remained neutral during the Second World War, but its sympathies were definitely with Nazi Germany. That was very clear in terms of, let's say, the legacy of them being allied during the First World War, of course, and all sorts of military and cultural links that were going on between the two countries. In the book, you'll see reference to a number of really anti-Semitic Turkish journalists who would go off to Berlin and get anti-Semitic material, come back to Turkey and publish it, such as the protocols the sages of Zion, just to give you an example. So definitely there was an influence. There was a strong presence of the Nazis in Istanbul during the 30s, and they were supporting pro-German publications. So there was a lot of that definitely played a role, specifically in the anti-Semitic component of that anti-minority atmosphere we're talking about. Now, would there be a direct link between the Germans and the Varlik? I have seen absolutely no evidence of that. Although indirectly, of course, there was a mindset, which was a ethno-nationalistic mindset that animated the Turkish government that was in common with the Nazi ideology. Hence, the decision to turn against all minorities and squeeze everything out of the, put all the money in the coffers of the state was something that obviously evokes what was going on in Nazi Germany.
Rachel Bortnick says the anti-Semitic cartoons during World War II were taken from the German newspapers. But of course, you make the point in the book that there were pro-Nazis, there were pro-Nazi journalists and editors working in Turkey at the time.
Very much so. And I quote a number of passages in the book from all sorts of publications that were pointing to the Jews as to this minority that was living it up, right, while everybody was struggling with the war economy. And that is, of course, not true. Yes, there may have been, and certainly was, a small elite, Gad Franco included, that was living a comfortable life, but there were plenty of poor Jews who were struggling like ordinary Turks in terms of what they could consume and aspire to consume and so on. So very definitely there was a, let's say, an anti-Semitic component of that anti-minority environment.
Mm-hmm. But in fact, it could save you, as Rosetta tells us in her comment, that in 1943, when Gad was sent to work camps, almost in the same year, her father was captured in Kos by the SS and was saved in Athens when he was already in the train that was directed to Auschwitz, because her mother was Turkish. So I've heard of other stories like that.
Right, Rosetta is a good, very dear cousin of mine, and I'm quite aware of that horrible story that happened at that point. We don't have time for too many details, but by then the roads of the Dodecanese had been in Italian hands, and they were not part of Turkey anymore. So the Germans felt they could descend upon them as they were allies with the Italians until September 1943. So that was a very terrible blow, the account of which, in fact, was narrated by Rosetta's ancestor, Hiskia, who was very close, who was a cousin of Gad's, with whom he worked very closely. Lynn, you may remember in the book how close Hiskia and Gad Franco were during their journalist days in Izmir.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So, you know, I suppose he must have felt really betrayed by him.
Yeah, so do you want to try and unmute
well,
again?
he's written a comment here. He said that the Varlik tax was made by the Turkish government so they could look tough towards Germany in the event that they would invade. And the 1934 riots, that's the Thrace riot, was instigated by an Armenian pro-Nazi and Turkish government elements who wanted to undermine the Jews due to their ultra-nationalist ideology. Well, that's fascinating.
Another read on those terrible events. Just to spend a minute on Thrace in 1934.
Yes.
In fact, the Republic had provided itself with a law whereby they could move populations around as they wanted, and they started doing that first and foremost with the Kurds. they wanted to dilute the Kurdish presence and basically remove them from their province of origin and put them elsewhere. So there was this kind of social engineering strategy of trying to forcefully integrate and forcefully turn into quote unquote real Turks minorities that were not considered to be starting with the Kurds. So what happened in Thrace, in fact, that very same pro-Nazi journalists were talking about before, started a whole propaganda machine against the presence of the Jews in Thrace. Thrace was a border province with Bulgaria. There was a lot of fear that that front may be caving in, that Turkey may be invaded. And as a response, there was this huge pogrom that didn't have as many victims, or rather, mostly caused the displacement and, of course, the loss of all the property and companies.
Yeah.
Of the Jews.
There's a question from Jonathan Rugman. What, if anything, did Ataturk say about Ottoman or Turkish Jews? And did he have any Jewish friends? Of course, there's a rumor that he himself was Jewish, isn't there?
Well, yeah, but I think it is just a rumor, and that he was born in Salonika, and Salonika was, such a Jewish city, and also the city of the Dönmes, where the former Jews, right, from Çağatay Zavi's times, and so on. But in fact, a couple of good friends of Gad's who were a doctor and a dentist were Ataturk's doctor and dentist. So I don't think that that Ataturk was an anti-Semite himself. I think he, again, saw all minorities as elements that needed to be crushed, to be transformed, to be Turkified, or to be ejected, because all minorities were not treated the same way. Some were sort of lost causes, right? So Greeks and Armenians, any Christian on the land of Turkey was seen as an internal enemy that had to be disposed of. So they were strongly encouraging for what was left of the Greek and Armenian community to evacuate, to leave, and did everything they could to get out. The Jews were not considered as bad as the Christians, in fact, and they were considered that could be potentially reformed, but the conditions that they were subjected to were extraordinarily punishing. So they had to stop speaking Ladino, they had to stop speaking French, stop being ultimately who they were. So this Turkification of the Jews was an impossible task that, in fact, was used against them, right, to repress them, persecute them, eventually, ultimately, to push them towards exile as soon as they could. They left in droves.
There's another question from Judith Romani. Do you see any continuity between anti-minority policies of Gad's period and Erdogan's policies of today? And actually, you don't mention the word dhimmi in your book, but I'm wondering whether the sort of anti-minority policies had deep roots in Islam, in this idea that non-Muslim minorities were inferior to Muslims.
Yes, so I have to acknowledge the limits of my understanding of these very complex issues, especially if I go beyond the times of Gad. I don't want to express expert opinions on things that I know of, really through keeping updated and reading. But yes, I do certainly know that in Erdogan's Turkey, which is another horribly authoritarian regime, which is there as we speak, there is a lot of profound anti-Semitism, and that what's left of the Jewish community is subject to intimidation and trying to preserve itself and its identity through policies and actions that are typical of a minority that's really in dire conditions. And I know, of course, through Turkish Jewish friends that there's an ongoing exodus of Turkish Jews out of Turkey and mostly moving to Israel. So there is sadly a continuity going back in time towards the dhimmi comment, Lynn. There, I think it would be unwise to look at the dhimminess through the lens of our human rights equality approach of the 21st century, right? What is true is that, and plenty of scholars have done serious work on this, much more than I have, that Christian and Jewish minorities were tolerated in the Ottoman Empire, had their own status, had their own jurisdiction, but were definitely considered inferior to the Muslims. That is a fact. And would we consider that anti-Semitism? It would be, I think, jarring to use that term to define that state. And of course, what many scholars have pointed out, and that even during the 19th century, right, if you compare the condition, and Gad himself wrote about this, right, comparing the rather privileged, as he thought, condition of Jews in the Ottoman Empire compared to what Jews were experiencing in Russia, on the Pale of Settlement, or the parts of Christendom. So, and if we go further back in time and conduct that comparison, we see that it is perhaps reasonable to say that overall Jews in Ottoman lands, in the lands of Islam, had it better, right, than what happened to Jews in the lands of Christendom. But again, I mean, I feel on much more complicated historical territory, and I don't want to abuse my author's credibility.
Well, I think Professor Kerem does endorse what you say. Modern Turkey did not tolerate internationalism, minority religions that had international connections or speaking foreign languages like Judeo-Spanish in public, which is exactly what you said. And Zionism was not tolerated as the Young Turk movement evolved. So can you say something about Zionism? I mean, how strong was the Zionist movement in Turkey?
From what I've understood, the Zionist movement suffered from two, let's say, original handicaps. One was that it was emerging from German-speaking Europe, right? And that all the conduits of communication within the Turkish Jewish community were really either through Ladino or through French. So there was really a clash between these two visions of the future of the Jews. On one side, the Alliance, which is Paris-based. On the other, it was a Zionist organization, which was German-centric. And when I think the Zionist organization realized the importance of convincing Turkish Jews to endorse the Zionist agenda, they did come up with a fairly well-structured strategy to communicate, and they moved a number of people to Constantinople, as it was called at the time. They bought over a number of newspapers. They started writing in Ladino and in French in order to make sure that they would get across. And they did have some amount of success, although, as I mentioned, all of this was, short-lived, because then, of course, the First World War happened. Empire. So there was no point really in trying to make inroads with the Sultan's court or with the Jewish community. But there was a fairly robust attempt at getting the message across, despite the fact that Turkish Jews were coming from a school of thought which is all about integration, assimilation, and Francophone vision of the future of the Jewish people.
But you would say that it was mainly push factors that made the Jewish community move to Israel rather than the pull of the promised land and that sort of thing.
That's definitely my reading. Having read the literature about it and personal accounts and so on, I definitely get the feeling that the bulk of the Jews who left in late 40s and early 50s left out of despair, left out of, having been walked all over and be beaten up so badly for 30 years. And then finally there was an opportunity of getting out. Because during the Second World War, obviously Jews could not go anywhere, right? If not for Palestine, if they could get themselves there, and then later on Israel. What's very sad, and Lynn, probably you noticed that in my book, how this departure of Turkish Jews was frowned upon, right? By the Turkish Jewish institutions were saying, well, they shouldn't be leaving, we're citizens. And the government itself that was saying, you see, you're leaving, you're not really a good Turkish citizen in the first place. They were being, humiliated as they were leaving everything behind. And the motherland where they had lived for 500 years, at least the Sephardis. So it was a very sad episode, I think. And as I mentioned briefly, although I don't develop it in great detail, but I think that the Turkish Jews' arrival in Israel was also pretty difficult, and it was a difficult time for everybody. But there was this community that had difficulties in communicating, that, as you mentioned, they weren't even really from the Arab world, right? There were linguistic issues, once again, of how to communicate. Who could they speak Ladino to? Who could they speak French to as they moved to Israel? It was
and the current community, can you put a figure on how many Turkish Jews there are currently?
In Turkey?
In Turkey?
I believe it's in the order of 20,000, but I am not 100% sure about that figure.
Mm-hmm. And do you see any future for the community in Turkey?
Again, it's more from hearsay and my exposure to other Turkish Jews, or real Turkish Jews, not myself. I get the sense that there's a real sense of despair, and that there's not really much room. Lately with what is happening between Israel and Gaza, there's been lots of anti-Semitic episodes I hear about in Smyrna, in Istanbul. It's very precarious. It's very precarious.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so I think we
I'll
will
give you one last chance if you can unmute himself.
Okay, one last chance to Yitzhak.
You hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, you won't see me. It doesn't matter. All right. So first of all, the Franco family is a very, very dignified Sephardic family, primarily rabbinic. Okay, they weren't secular. I think God was unusual, but he was a product of his time. Okay, he's known as the founder, one of the authors of the Turkish Constitution. That's his claim to fame. He wasn't the only one, but he was a group of people. And as you demonstrated, because of the Varlik, he was betrayed. Okay, betrayed grossly. But his generation, David Fresco, is very anti-Zionist. So it's the same class. It sounds very logical that Gad Franco would marry Fresco's daughter. They believed in the Ottoman Empire. They believed in the Young Turk movement, together with his name was Yitzhak Moise Cohen. His nickname was Tekken Alp. He was a symbol of sort of like the new Turk. Okay, and he also was duped by 20. He was in the parliament, but by 1921 he also was duped. I mean, you also, I think, have to realize that Ataturk and the regime, they're political animals also. Afterward, already in the 40s and 50s, there were Jews who were executed in political skirmishes. Okay, so it's not because they're Jewish, it's because this is how sometimes things were done. In general, in the Ottoman period, the Jews are tolerated. You can't look at it like the Israeli-Arab conflict that the Muslims are the bad guys and they don't like the Jews. Okay, the Jews were a devoted minority. Okay, the Ottoman Empire and Islam doesn't want a sovereign foreign non-Muslim state. So there was no way that the Ottomans were going to recognize Zionism and a Jewish state, okay, afterward. Because of what happened, God made a turnaround, okay? But the Franco family, they also migrated to the Americas, okay? You know, just like everyone else, but they were very rooted in Jerusalem and in Hebron. And so it's a very special family. Now, Avram Franco was in Jerusalem as he was the like the Secretary General or the Secretary of the municipality from 1921 to 1953 under 14 Jewish, Arab, Christian, and Muslim mayors.
And
so,
if I can interrupt you, that same Moshe Franco, who I mentioned earlier in my presentation, who was Gad's uncle, he eventually became the Rishon LeZion, the head Sephardic rabbi in Jerusalem, right? So you are right.
Right, he was the chief rabbi for 3 years, as in his older phase. You also had another prominent rabbi called the Harif, Rachamim Franco, from Rhodes, who went to Livorno, and he was the chief rabbi in Hebron. He had been the chief dayan in Jerusalem. So it's a very eminent family. So Avram Franco's father died when he was young. So Abraham Franco took over the head of the Jewish community of Hebron. He was also a Turkish soldier in World War I and also was in Damascus. But Abraham Franco's claim to fame was that he persuaded the House, after the 29 riots, he persuaded the House of Lords to let the Jews go back to Hebron, and they were there from 31 to 36. So Gad Franco fits into this family. He wasn't unusual. There were others who were very outstanding and erudite like him. Usually it isn't portrayed that he got duped in the end. I think that's something that you added. I sat twice with your uncle, and he talked about problems that God had in the Turkish establishment, et cetera, et cetera. Ataturk was not anti-Semitic. He was a fourth Dunme. I have his whole pedigree, but in secular Turkey, you couldn't talk about that. And what we have today, we have this crazy Erdogan, who's a fundamentalist, okay, and which is totally paradoxical to everything which has happened in Turkey in the last since the 1200s. Okay, there was never a tyrant like this before. Okay, but he's on good terms with the Jews. Okay, but he's, you know, he wants to be a sultan. He's pro Hamas, et cetera, et cetera. But no, I think it's important what you did. There's a lot of Israeli scholarship which you probably don't know about, which you know, if you ever continue, it'd be interesting for you to hear about and read.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's great to have an expert on the call. Well, another expert. But just before we close, last question, really. I think it was from Rachel. Do you have any plans to publish it in Turkish?
I would love to. I hope that the English version gets some traction first, and if we get any interesting results in that respect, I'm thinking of a French version, hoping that there may be an audience for that in France, and of course I'd be delighted to publish it in Turkish as well. Yes, Rachel, very much so.
Great. Well, I wish you all the best with it. I think Lawrence has put the link to the Amazon in the chat. Obviously, you may be able to get it from other sources. Anyway, so it just remains for me to thank you so much for a wonderful session, and I wish you luck with your book. Before we go, we will do what we usually do, I think, and let everybody say hello. And
I have to remove one person who won't give me their name.
Okay. So we will give you a chance to unmute and say something.
Before you go,
yeah.
Thank you very much for hosting me, and to Harif and your team, this incredible group of volunteers that keep all of this going. And I was just delighted to be here and have you and the audience to talk to about this piece of work. So I'm delighted I was able to present it. I hope some of you may be tempted to read the book and perhaps give me feedback and ideas.
Absolutely. Well, it was our pleasure. Our pleasure indeed. Just to talk about our next session, I think we have the speaker for the next session on the call, if he's still there, William Clarence Smith, and he'll be talking about something completely different, Jews in the Philippines. But of course, there's always a Sephardi connection. So that's in 2 weeks' time on the 16th of January. Again, a reminder that if you're not on the Harif mailing list, please do subscribe. And these are some of the future events. Israeli Burekas films, absolute must if you're interested in cinema. And we've got more talks scheduled for February, one on Iraqi Jewish surnames, and there'll be one on Jewish heritage as well. Okay, so I think Lawrence will now do his thing and
stop sharing the screen.
Stop sharing the screen, and you'll all be able to say something.
Yeah, no, I have removed all the iPhones.
Okay.
People wouldn't tell me who they were.
All the security risks have now been removed.
The known security risks have been removed. No, it's a lovely talk, fascinating talk.
Okay.
Sorry, security. Okay, everyone can now unmute themselves, but if we can do it in a disciplined way, and I will remove the spotlights. So, Lynn, you no longer have a spotlight.
No, that's fine. And Anthony, if you'd like to stay with us just for another few minutes.
Very great pleasure.
I've removed the spotlight. I can't remove your spotlight. It won't let me remove it.
Good. Okay. So does anyone want to say something?
Holly wants.
Holly, where are you?
I'm here. First of all, Anthony, happy and healthy New Year to you. And thank you so much for sharing your grandpa, Gad, with all of us. And I want to ask you, is this Gad, is he grandpa on your maternal or your maternal or paternal side?
On my maternal side.
Oh, okay. And you mentioned you were born in Rome, so that must mean, were you raised in Italy?
I was, yes, I was.
Thank you so much. And Lynn and Lawrence, as always, thank you again so much. And I apologize, I missed your last presentation. I had a bad cold.
Oh, don't worry, we forgive you.
Happy and healthy New Year to all of you.
So Holly is our regular. She's always giving us the vote of thanks, and thank you for that, Holly. So,
thank you very much. Could I just say that I will be talking about Turkish Jews in 2 weeks' time, and that Turkish Jews were actually a very important component of the Philippines community. So we heard about the turn to Latin America through Ladino, with Ladino helping. It's the same in the Philippines.
Wonderful. So we can't wait to hear all about it, William. So thank you.
Any particular families involved?
Yes, I've got a whole list. I'll be giving you. Yes, there's many families. Yeah,
that's wonderul.
Families like the Abulafia, I'm sure you've heard of. And
yes,
gosh, they're everywhere.
Yeah,
they're everywhere.
Thank you very much. I live in Lima, Peru. I wanted to know if Anthony knows that here in our community there are families Franco and Bigio.
Yes, I do. I do know. I know that the Bigio diaspora is really as extensive as the Franco one, and especially in Latin America. And I've had the opportunity once I was in Colombia, actually in Bogota, to meet some Bigios, and as we all do when we go abroad, look up phone books and find that there are scattered members of the extended family that are around. So thank you very much for that. It was a
Sorry, Tony, ciao, Piero. Tony, Sì, ho visto che ci stava fra il pubblico una persona che si chiama Korkos.
I know. Can you switch to English?
Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, there was somebody that was called Korkos. The name was made.
Yes, Sydney.
My mother is Korkos.
Okay. Yes, he's from Essaouira in Morocco originally. He now lives in Israel.
Essaouira. Okay. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Just for information,
Hi,
I
Tony.
have a lot.
Talk to you later. Ciao.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Just for information, Anthony, I have a lot of Bigios on my website and from Egypt. And many of them went to Brazil and Latin America. So maybe you can find some relatives there.
I would love to. Thanks for that. Thank you, Alain.
Okay, that was
Farhi.org.
Alan Farhi, who runs a magnificent website, genealogical website called Les Fleurs d'Orient.
Of course, we've been there many, many times, but I'm delighted to see you in person, although Zoom.
By the way, there was a lot. I had a very good friend, Farhi, who was born in Istanbul, and his father was exiled during World War II to Ankara. And this is one of his older brother, who passed away recently in London, who was vice president of Penn, and he wrote a lot about Turkey at that time. His name is Maurice Farhi.
Yes, I read his books, which are really
famous.
very enjoyable.
Yeah. That's right. I think he died.
He died a few years ago. Yeah. One of his best article was how he was taken by his helper to the hammam, and because he went there as a young boy, he was admitted in the women's section. And one day the guard asked him to take a test, and he pinched him his genital, and when he found out it wasn't soft, he kicked him out.
Oh my God!
And it's called Les Lentilles or something like this. If he wrote, it's written in French and English. And I have it on my website. The whole document.
Yes, yeah.
Hello. I wanted to make one observation, having studied and spent some time in Tunisia as a graduate student 50 years ago. A lot of interesting parallels in terms of how Jews in Tunisia dealt with the nationalist movement and their initial involvement under Habib Bourguiba, very involved, but then long before even Israel, the wars, but a lot of them had studied in French lycées once the French became the protectorate power in 1881. But very interesting developments as Jews, Tunisian Jews, sought to be part of the nationalist movement, but gradually divisions emerged, as you described, in Turkey between the Muslim-dominated nationalist movement and the Tunisian Jews. So anyway, thank you. It was a wonderful presentation and interesting learning of those developments as they occurred. I would say one more thing, more just of interest, maybe more to me than anyone, but I went to Brandeis. One of my classmates is a Turk who was the Turkish ambassador to the United States in the early 2000s, Farouk Logalu. But he was, as I say, a Brandeis classmate of mine in attendance for all 4 years back in the early 1960s. So interesting connections there as well. Thank you.
Very much so.
Interesting that you mentioned Tunis, because of course that was another one of these cosmopolitan trading ports, like Smyrna, like Alexandria, like Beirut, and with a similar sort of composition of different foreigners, you would call them. I mean, as well as Jews, you'd have Maltese and Italians, and all of those obviously ended up leaving. Yeah. So as you say, plenty of parallels. Yeah. Okay. Well, if nobody else wants to say anything, I think we will bring this to a close. Just on behalf of myself and Lawrence, our technical expert here, I'd like to wish everybody a happy new year. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Anthony, and see you all next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Thank you.
Come back again, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you very much to Harif.
With the next book. With the next book.
Absolutely. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Inshallah.
Stay well, everybody.
You too.
Bye.
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 And stay safe.
Yes.